Well, sisters and brothers, the other day I was having dinner with the brother Franciscans, and, just like any other family, we're having conversations about our past and things that we really enjoyed. And the topic of camping came up, because as many of you probably know by now, I love the nature. Surprise, surprise, a Franciscan loves nature. But when we were talking about camping, one of the other brothers shared with me that when he was younger and he was in the Boy Scouts, he went on a camping trip, and he didn't really have such a good time. He began to tell us how they were setting up, and it was raining, and it was the dark of night, and they were soaking wet, struggling to get the camp set up. Finally, they're absolutely drenched, and it came time to go to bed. And he laid down. He's on a pile of rocks. Everywhere he tried to move, he was just some rock poking up in his back. And he couldn't sleep a wink. And as he shared this story with him, I couldn't help but look at him and say, well, brother, why did you set up in the dark? Such an obvious thing, right? I mean, we all know the difference between daylight and darkness. How much harder it is to see our surroundings when we're in the dark. Every good camper knows that you set up camp first so you can survey the surroundings. You can find where the proper place is, where the water will run. Light is a funny thing. Because on the one hand, it's ever present. It's so abundant that how often do we actually think about it? Especially in our modern times where with just the flick of a switch, we can bring light into the room. It's so powerful and so essential and so ever present, and yet we hardly notice it. Strange thing, isn't it? It's amazing how the moment you turn on the light, everything changes, and yet nothing changes. The room is still the same room. Surroundings are still the same surroundings. And yet such a simple thing can change everything. It's no surprise that Jesus uses this image of light and darkness. And he talks to Nicodemus, as we heard before, and says, to be born again in the Spirit. It's such a strange thing, right? We could imagine that it would be easy to understand if when we were baptized, when we were born again, if you will, in the Spirit, we grew another eyeball on our forehead, right? Then you'd be able to see somebody and that person's been baptized. That person's different. And yet, what does it mean to be born in the Spirit, to become a new creation? On the one hand, it seems like nothing changed. Still the same person, still the same world. And yet, on the other hand, everything has changed. That is the power of the light. As I was reflecting on this, I go back to our first reading, and we look at the lives of the apostles. And if we want to understand this, I think the best thing to do is to look at them. We followed them throughout the Gospels, and how many mistakes after mistakes do they make, right? They each have their own unique personalities, their own demons that they're struggling with, their own ideas of how the community ought to work together. They're constantly bickering and fighting with one another. Peter telling Jesus not to do what he's come to do. And then the resurrection happens. And Jesus appears to them in all of his splendor, and glory, and breathes on them the Spirit. And now they are people of the light. They're the same men, and yet entirely different, aren't they? We don't see that ragtag group of bickering and fighting. Now we see men who are alive with faith, not hiding away anymore. I mean, they've been arrested, thrown in jail, and then by a miracle of God, they are freed. Now, most of us, the first thing we would do is what? Get out of town. Hide. What's the first thing they do? They go to the synagogue, they go to the people, and start doing it again. The same people. And yet now everything is different. They can see now. You know, that is the great mystery of our faith and what it is to be born again in the Spirit, to be a people alive in the light. And the question would be, why would anyone choose to remain in darkness? Seeing such obvious transformation in these men. And indeed, many people did come to follow them and come to follow the light. But why would we choose to remain in darkness? Why would I choose to set up my camp in the middle of the night? It seems absurd. And yet Jesus gives us his answer. Because we're hiding. There's no other reason. If the things that we do, we don't want others to know, we do it in the dark of night, don't we? It's not such a surprise. Often you'll talk to police officers and they'll tell you in the middle of the night is their busy time. Not a surprise. But also we conceal so much about ourselves. We put on faces so that the world will think that we're one thing. We hide. And yet, if we remain hidden, we remain in darkness. And how can we ever see the world in all its splendor, in all its beauty? Indeed, how can we even see ourselves if we are constantly hiding? And so, this is why Jesus says at the very beginning of his ministry to repent and come before the Lord. Because that is an act of bravery and humility. To say, I choose to step into the light because I know the Lord will not reject me. I have no need to fear what he sees. It will be painful at first, and it will be difficult to do. And so it requires courage. And it also requires a humility, which means an acceptance of the truth. I want to step in the light. I want to show it all. I don't want to hide anymore. Because I have seen what Christ can do. And I know that he will not reject me. And so I step out into the light. And then everything changes. We find now that we can see our surroundings in a way that we never could before. And the thing that we kept stumbling against time and time again, stubbing our toe in the dark, finally we can see it now. The Lord has revealed the way to go. Nothing changes, and yet everything changes. And we see that play out in the lives of the apostles. And that is the kind of spirit and the kind of evangelization that Jesus is calling us to live. To be a people who no longer hide away in the darkness, but step out into the light. Not being afraid to share before the Lord our weaknesses and our stumblings. being a people of courageous faith, that the Lord will accept us no matter what. As long as we step into the light, everything changes. And then people begin to notice there's something different. You're the same person, you look the same, you didn't grow a new eye, and yet there's something different about you. It's almost as if you can see things that I cannot see. And people begin to want the same for themselves. And so, sisters and brothers, in this Easter time, let us continue to step out into the light. Let us take that courageous act to bear ourselves wholly and wholeheartedly before God. And everything will change.